Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Priya Natarajan. I'm a faculty member in the departments of astronomy and physics at Yale, and I also serve as the current director of the university's flagship interdisciplinary program, the Franke Program in Science and the Humanities. I am delighted to invite you all to today's talk by a brilliant colleague, Professor Hazel Carby, and this talk is part of the Franke Program's Distinguished Speaker Series. But before I introduce her, I would like to begin by first thanking our benefactors, Mr. and Mrs. Richard and Barbara Franke, who have joined us today, and whose generosity enables this unique cross-disciplinary engagement and conversations and collaborations that transcend traditional academic disciplinary boundaries. Also, I would like to remind all of you that as we are recording this event, I would like to request you all to mute your audio and videos. If you wish, please feel free to start submitting questions through the Q&A feature, and Hazel will take your questions after finishing her talk. Now to today's wonderful speaker. Hazel V. Carby is the Charles C. and Dorothea Dilley Professor Emeritus of African American Studies and Professor Emeritus of American Studies at Yale University. She's also a Fellow of the Royal Society for the Arts. She's currently a visiting research professor and Humanities Institute faculty at Dartmouth College. Her research work has focused on race, gender, and sexuality in Caribbean and diasporic culture and literature. And her work has centered on transnational and post-colonial literature and theory in representations, examining the representations of the Black female body and in the genres of science fiction. Her work engages deeply with and interrogates the discrepancies between the symbolic constructions of the Black experience and the actual lived lives of African Americans. A pioneering voice and formidable intellect in Black feminism, she is recognized as one of the world's leading scholars on race and gender. One of her most influential contributions to African diaspora studies came with her very first book, Reconstructing Womanhood, The Emergence of the Afro-American Woman Novelist, published in 1987. A formidable scholar, she's the recipient of many awards and honors. She's notably the author of several award-winning books, including Imperial Intimacies, A Tale of Two Islands, published by Verso in 2019, selected as one of the books of the year for 2019 by the Times Literary Supplement. She's also the winner of British Academy's Naif Al-Rodhan Prize for Global Cultural Understanding, awarded in 2020. Further recognition of her work includes her selection as a finalist for the John Pope Franklin Publication Prize in 2020. Also, in last year, her book Imperial Intimacies earned recognition in the highly commended category of the Penn Hessel Tiltman Prize. I could go on and on reading out all her wonderful achievements, honors, and awards. But without further ado, I am really excited to hear from her today. So on to you, Hazel. And we are so thankful that you accepted our invitation to speak at the Franke Program.
Thank you very much, Priya. I'm just going to share my screen. So thank you very much for the invitation to give this lecture. It's actually drawn from the book that you were talking about, Priya, Imperial Intimacies, which I like to describe as a very British story. It's a story of the everyday ties, relations, and what I think of as intricate interdependencies of empire and colonialism. It does not conform to the way in which most stories of empire have been told, and it questions what we think we know about our shared colonial past. I incorporate stories of my Welsh mother, my Jamaican father, and their ancestors, one of whom you'll hear about today, into material drawn from colonial archives and histories to show how they were shaped by the times and the places in which they lived. But family stories and historical accounts can actually sit very uneasily side by side. When I assembled the various pieces, I found that rather than cohere into a unified narrative, their juxtaposition revealed the shards of conflict and contradiction that familial, national, and imperial ideologies work to conceal. I used family memories as a guide to navigate material in the National Archives of Jamaica and the UK. But when I stumbled, I had to put aside the voices of my relatives because they hindered my ability to see what they had disguised, what they had hidden, and what they had absolutely no intention of passing on. So Imperial Intimacies is an account written from the perspective of someone of Jamaican Welsh ancestry who does not take for granted definitions of being British, but rather is interested in how subjects become British and how people are inscribed into ideologies of empire and beliefs of whiteness that enable them to feel superior even when they are desperately poor. The story of imperial relations is as restless as the Atlantic, surging between the islands of Britain and Jamaica. And I follow currents that draw me back into the mid-18th century. We won't be going back that far today. Basically, today I'm going to be concentrating on an area at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. But the book is also anchored in the particular places in which people in my family lived and died. The urban centres of London, Bath, Bristol, Cardiff, and Kingston, and the rural landscapes of Devon, Somerset, Lincolnshire, and Portland. It's not an exceptional story about becoming British, but instead it really asserts that Britishness harbours the deepest interconnections of class and race and gender. Trying to find your way as the white mother of a black child, for example. Trying to survive as a black child in a colony and a black man in the metropole. And being a girl who was regarded as an oxymoron when she claimed she was both black and British. So I'm going to begin with this quote by Stuart Hall. He said, "Identity is not only a story, a narrative which we tell ourselves about ourselves. It is a story, it is stories which change with historical circumstances. And identity shifts with the way in which we think and hear them and experience them. Far from only coming from the still small point of truth inside us, identities actually come from outside. They are the way in which we are recognized and then come to step into the place of the recognitions which others give us. Without the others, there is no self. There is no self-recognition. So today I'm actually going to give an example of how in the book I use and complicate this question of identity. The example will be from Bristol and in terms of the place, and the example of the character will be the person I know as, but also imagine as and have created as my grandmother. So all the stories I was told by relatives anchor my maternal family's identity in Bristol, the West Country, and Wales. But I know that my grandmother, her name was Beatrice Williams, must have felt that she also belonged to the larger world of the British Empire. And one of my questions is, how was her sense of self shaped by her environment? And what did she know of the city's past? Bristol had been intimately entangled with the colonial world for centuries. So how did Beatrice come to understand herself as a British subject who was part of an empire that ruled over a third of the globe? I lean in through time and space to tap my grandmother on the shoulder and speak to her. As she turns towards me, I ask Beatrice if she is like her granddaughter, if the streets of the city are her avenue of escape as they were to the girl. I make Beatrice explore every inch of her city as her granddaughter explored hers. When my grandmother had the time to leave her neighbourhood of Bedminster, cross the River Avon and explore the city centre, she would have walked up East Street, crossing the New Cut on the Bedminster Bridge. On her way to the Prince Street Bridge, which is an iron swing bridge that crosses the floating harbour, she would have passed this street, Guinea Street, near the docks. Was Beatrice aware of the derivation of the name Guinea? Once the site of the homes of men who traded in human flesh, the street's name resonates with associations, not only to the West African coast, but to the coin of exchange used by the Royal African Company. The built environment of the centre of Bristol still exudes self-satisfied achievement in character and appearance. The architectural grandeur and the grace of public institutions and residential squares is ample evidence of centuries of accumulated wealth. When Beatrice was a young woman, the city appeared to wear its history on its surfaces. But for centuries, Bristol's public face hid the ignominious origins of its wealth. Without exception, my maternal relatives revered Bristol. They lived and worked in its poorest districts, but they emulated the stolid respectability of its wealthy citizens. My grandmother's desire to achieve, a driving ambition she instilled in my mother, her daughter, has its roots here in Bristol, a city that nurtured and nourished the dreaming of strivers. Bristol had an exceptionally robust civic culture embedded in libraries, schools, museums, and theatres, which encouraged and confirmed ambition and proffered a sense of entitlement to its citizens. Even if Beatrice was unable to afford tickets to actually attend a theatre, the library was free, as were lectures, lantern slideshows, and many other public events. For a young woman whose working life was confined to domestic labour, the wealth of civic life offered scope for her imagination. However unattainable, the city held promise for a future, becoming modern and becoming educated. I believe that Beatrice's fierce determination to send her own daughter to a fine high school for girls was stimulated by the flourishing educational institutions that she saw around her, including Colston Girls' School, and here the University College of Bristol, which became Bristol University in 1909. It was the city's wealthy merchant philanthropists and large, stable bourgeoisie that had endowed Bristol with its libraries, its schools and universities, and with the 18th century Georgian architecture of its monumental civic buildings, broad avenues, and substantial houses. Nourished by its civic pride, Bristol made strivers of my maternal ancestors, all of whom clung to the ethics and the values of bourgeois aspiration. They felt a strong allegiance, in fact, to the British bourgeoisie, even though they could never, ever achieve its level of financial wealth. Only when I became an adult was I able to distinguish between the subtleties and the variations of allegiance, the multiple meanings of Bristol in the particular lives and individual pasts of my relatives. Bristol exerted symbolic power for them in its promise for the future. The possibility of progress was the realization and fulfillment of a peculiar form of British dreaming. And gradually I learnt to question the foundation upon which British dreams of futurity and British dreams of belonging were built. Promise flourished because it was grounded in and generated by the wealth and the stability visible in the bricks and mortar of everyday Bristol life, constructed by the city's merchants. The architecture clearly was testimony to British success in trade, to the ethics of hard work, the value of profit, and imperial power. Concealed was the source of that profit. The enslaved labor that financed the city's economy from the 18th century onwards, and which paved the way for Bristol's modernity. The enslaved labor that enabled its Georgian grace, founded its civic culture, and made possible its philanthropic works. Sugar, tobacco, and cocoa were integral to Bristol's economy and its culture. The city was noted for its chocolate and confectionery works, which alongside tobacco factories employed large numbers of its residents. The structures that were emblems of the city's modernity, however, physically disguised the roots of its wealth in enslavement and continued colonial oppression. Centuries of brutal exploitation of African peoples enabled the philanthropy that brought enormous benefit as well as civic grace to this English city and its citizens. The Wills family, a tobacco family, became abolitionists eventually, and yet they donated the profits of enslavement to the city of Bristol, not to the enslaved who had labored to grow and harvest the tobacco they sold. The city's abolitionist hero, Edward Colston, considered Bristol's great benefactor, built schools, almshouses, hospitals, and churches with money that he had accrued from the trade in enslaved human beings while a member of the Royal African Company and the Society of Merchant Ventures. Merchant Venturers, I should say. Colston Girls' School was recently renamed, actually, Montpelier High School, after this statue of Edward Colston was unceremoniously dumped in the Bristol harbour. Bristol was deeply bound to the enslavement and transportation of Africans in the Atlantic trade. But it is misleading to reduce this history to the economic activities of a few wealthy individuals or traders. Beatrice and her family passed by and went in and out of Bristol schools, libraries, and churches, but nothing enabled them to see the connection between trading in human beings and Bristol's history, its wealth, and civic culture. Impressed by the grand Georgian houses of Queen Square, Royal York Crescent, and Clifton, they regarded the buildings as confirmation of achievement, the realization of ambition and success in business. Now, profits to Bristol and its citizens were enormous, both from the export of their goods to the African coast for the purchase of human beings, and from the resale of human chattel in the Caribbean. A financial outlay by merchants of £660 could reap a profit of 1,000% minus the cost of transportation. A plantation owner for an outlay of £31 purchased an enormous amount of labour power. Investment in the trade was only one source of profits that accrued to Bristol. Residents of the city could reap financial gain from participation in the myriad trades related to transatlantic slavery. Through investment or employment, producing goods for export to Africa and the American slave colonies, servicing and manning the ships that left Bristol on transatlantic voyages, refining in Bristol the products of slave labour, and handling sugar and tobacco cargoes from plantation colonies. The trade in enslaved people was closely interwoven with the wider commercial and economic fabric of the city. In the late 18th century, at least 40% of the income of Bristolians derived from slavery-related activities. It was not only the merchants trading in enslaved human beings who profited, but barrel makers, brothel keepers, chandlers, candle makers, carpenters, dock workers, innkeepers, laundresses, sailors, sailmakers, and shoemakers. So you get my point, everyone benefited. Bristol was a city produced in circuits of exchange with Jamaica. If the history of Bristol's financial dreams has been intimately tied to the enslavement of others, it is also true that at the center of this intimacy was the island of Jamaica. In 1655, Oliver Cromwell seized Jamaica from the Spanish, initiating British imperial rule of a nation that would become one of the world's leading sugar exporting, slave-driven countries, and establishing the close economic relationship between Bristol and Jamaica for sugar, tobacco, and the trade in enslaved humans. This relationship transformed and enriched both Bristol and Jamaica planters, because Jamaica was the largest sugar island in the British Caribbean and traditionally the best market for slaves transported in Bristol ships. The total number of Africans who were forcibly dragged aboard British ships in chains will never be known, and exact numbers are not available for the 2,106 ships that left Bristol for the African coast and from there sailed with their human cargo to the Caribbean. 901 of these ships sailed to Jamaica. Although final inventories are not available for Bristol ships, historians estimate that 587,000 Africans were enslaved and that 486,000, or 82.8%, landed alive in the Americas. From the 1,591 voyages to the Caribbean, 445,487 enslaved humans were embarked onto Bristol ships, and 371,306 disembarked. 217,263 of them were landed in Jamaica. I seek a reckoning with these inventories. I have to find a way to decipher the apparently unfathomable oceanic computation in which my ancestors remain shackled. Among these anonymous hundreds of thousands penned in black ink on graph paper are girls and women who survived the Middle Passage and are sold in Port Antonio, Jamaica, where they will become the property of a man called Carby. But just as Beatrice is unable to recognize the past in her present, neither can she imagine a future in which her daughter will marry a descendant of this man and one of these women. As Beatrice grew from child to adult, the most pervasive ideology of modernity was the new imperialism of late Victorian and Edwardian Britain. This was a period of massive and rapid territorial expansion for the industrial countries of Western Europe, who, in competition with each other, sought new colonial acquisitions and the consolidation of their control over indigenous peoples in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Through image and spectacle, Beatrice would not only have become conscious of the vast reach of the British Empire, but would also have been introduced into the racial logics of whiteness. Did she become convinced of the superiority of imperial power? And did she believe, despite her poverty, that she was a member of a superior race destined to rule over a third of the globe? So one of the most popular forms of entertainment was the magic lantern. But lantern slideshows were also quickly recognized for their educational potential in schools where they were used for teaching geography, history, and science. The head teacher of Bath Road Board School in Bristol, for example, built a collection of over 2,000 slides for use in the classroom. Lantern shows infinitely expanded the spatial and the geographical horizons of everyday life. In 1902, a visual instruction committee was set up by the Secretary of State for the Colonies to produce lantern slides on the UK for use in the territories of its empire. And 5 years later, the committee embarked on a scheme to provide lecture materials for use in British schools. But imperialism and the racism, which was its primary characteristic, existed in many forms of lantern slides. In school classrooms, in town and village halls, the magic lantern shows projected the racism and imperialism of the age, justifying the need for and the rightness of British rule in their portrayal of the peoples of the empire and of military exploits in colonial wars in Egypt and the Sudan, South Africa, and India. In 1897, hand-tinted lantern slides of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee were shown all over the country. And the initial slide you saw at the beginning of this lecture is one of those. These shows were visual enactments and effective realizations of imperialism, watching the jingoistic spectacle of colonial genuflection to the mother of empire generated patriotic emotion and desire. The sequences of ceremonial procession were manifestations of colonial possession, and scenes of general joy and unbounded loyalty, of the visceral pleasure of dwelling in and belonging to what was called Greater Britain. Local stores not only invoked colonialism in their names, like the British and Colonial Meat Company, but they also signaled a shift away from dependence on domestic agriculture toward the increasing importation of food. The Home and Colonial Tea Stores began as a trading association in 1885, and by 1903 had over 400 retail outlets in Britain, including a branch here on East Street in Bedminster, where my grandmother lived. In addition to tea, they sold a narrow range of products, sugar, bacon, ham, margarine, and butter, but increased their profit margin through ownership of their producers and their processors overseas, as well as in the UK. Their shop counters had rows of compartments filled with different varieties of tea from plantations developed in India and Sri Lanka, which was then called the Crown Colony of Ceylon. Here is a Jubilee handkerchief. Retail stalls with multiple outlets competed for urban shoppers through competitive pricing and long opening hours. Although they aimed to attract the working class, Beatrice would not have entered these stores. She could only stare through their windows, for they protected their profits by refusing to issue credit on which the poor depended. But there was so much to see, even from outside, since window displays formed a rich street culture of colonial information and advertising. The companies that adopted innovative advertising techniques were those whose goods were at the heart of the imperial economy: tea, chocolate, soaps and oils, tobacco, and meat extracts. Biscuit tins, chocolate wrappings, mugs, and tea cloths commemorated coronations and the Jubilee, reproduced colonial flags, and used celebratory images of British royalty and military might. Though the family could not possibly have afforded to purchase them, commemorative mugs and biscuit and chocolate tins would have brightened the shelves of their home in their railway cottage, because they were distributed free to school children, being one of the prime means by which school boards encouraged patriotism in children. The windows of newsagents were festooned with visual representations of the empire on which the sun never sets, including picture postcards and juvenile papers with images of colonial adventures, which were widely circulated through the practice of swapping individual issues. Young people were also absolutely avid collectors of cigarette cards. On East Street sat the large factory of W.D. and H.O. Wills, the largest manufacturer of tobacco products, which incorporated 12 other companies to form the Imperial Tobacco Company in 1901. The cigarette cards they produced were perhaps the most influential form of collectible imperial propaganda, combining visual and textual information with clear pedagogic intent. They were issued in series, and blank albums were sold to mount and display the cards. There were a number of card series devoted to all aspects of empire, including arms, like you see here, flags, builders of empire, Britain's defenders, children of all nations, Indian regiments, governor generals, engineering wonders, army life, and the Royal Navy. For Beatrice, as for her generation, a prerequisite of being a modern British citizen was being an imperial subject. Visual spectacle generated and confirmed their patriotism, their loyalty, not only to nation, but to empire. The aggressive expansion and the maintenance of territorial dominance necessitated war in far-flung regions, the significance of which was brought home through public celebrations of military might. The return of units of the British Army from the Boer War in 1902 were occasions for patriotic spectacle, as they paraded through the streets of cities and towns all over the country. Mitchell and Kenyon, a Lancashire-based film company who were pioneers in the production of British motion pictures, travelled south to produce a film of the crowds gathered in Bristol to greet the return of war hero Lord Methuen, despite of his numerous failures on the battlefield. For Beatrice, like many others, this would have been her first experience of witnessing the making of a moving picture. Death, as you see here, also occasioned spectacles of patriotic sentiment aimed at cementing local ties to soldiers killed thousands of miles away. In Bristol, large groups of spectators were drawn to the pomp and ceremony surrounding the 1905 unveiling of the Boer War Memorial in honour of the Gloucester Regiment garrisoned in the city of Bristol. Beginning in 1902, Empire Day was celebrated annually on the 24th of May. And the British Empire League furnished schools with flags. This was Beatrice's last year in school, actually, and she would have been among the students who performed in the patriotic plays and processions which were supported by local councils who contributed to refreshments and commemorative mugs. These were also lucrative occasions for lantern slide makers, who would photograph the children and their activities and then sell the shows to the schools. Pageants celebrating empire were held in Bristol throughout the decade, and one of the most spectacular is recorded on a postcard, this postcard, where hundreds of children formed a living Union Jack in Victoria Park. What did Beatrice or her mother Rose, my great-grandmother, know about Jamaica and Jamaicans, other than what could be found on the back of a Will's cigarette card? My maternal relatives were vehemently, implacably opposed to the relationship between my mother and the Jamaican airman who would become my father. Their understanding of their allegiance to empire, their belonging as white, imperial, racially superior British subjects, was formed, maintained, and reinforced in these mundane details of daily life, in shopping, storing biscuits, and drinking tea. What could have exposed the history of violence and exploitation that bound Bristol and Jamaica? Beatrice may have noticed a poster advertising Jamaica, the new Riviera, on a museum board, or in the window of the Dunstan optical lantern and photographic store on St. Augustine Parade. I imagine her carefully noting the place, date, and time of the lantern show, which promised vibrant images of a beautiful island, of luxurious vegetation, lovely scenery, refreshed by invigorating sea breezes. James Johnson's lecturing tours in the UK between 1901 and 1903 were part of a larger capitalist project of colonial modernization and heralded the opening of a new shipping service between Bristol and Jamaica under contract with the Imperial Direct Line. Joseph Chamberlain, who was Secretary of State for the Colonies from 1895 to 1903, was the leader of those advocating for a new imperialism, and he was the architect of programs for its implementation. He was convinced that Britain had to ensure its economic future and military dominance through closer links with the colonies and the expansion of empire. Chamberlain actually was the one who organized the celebration of Britain's first Diamond Jubilee in 1897 as an imperial spectacle, because he understood how empire could be visualized and how it could be enacted, how it could be harnessed for its ideological potential to secure the affiliation and the allegiance of British citizens. Chamberlain financed a coterie of imperialist men in a plan to increase trade and open Jamaica to tourism. Bristol was the fulcrum of this plan, which was intended to impel Jamaica to become modern, by which was meant becoming a more profitable colony. To this end, the British government awarded Alfred Lewis Jones, managing director of the Liverpool-based Elder Dempster Shipping Company, a contract to take over all steamships running between the West Indies and the UK. Jones was to form a new shipping line, the Imperial Direct West India Mail Company, to run between Bristol and Kingston and open a transatlantic market, introducing bananas to the British and the wealthy British to Jamaica. Chamberlain promised to subsidize the venture if Jones would take the leading role in promoting a new Jamaica and building a market in the UK. In the 1750s, luxury items like chocolate and coffee were available in the shops of Bristol. During the early years of the 20th century, the British public were to be persuaded to consume bananas and dream of Jamaica. I wonder if Beatrice or her sister Maud purchased bananas from a cart being wheeled down a Bristol street here by a black man selling the fruit at 2 for a penny halfpenny. Would the sisters have stood stock still at such a sight? Would they have been taken aback? Were the black residents of Bristol a familiar sight to them, so common that they took their presence for granted? An African banana skin, dated in fact to approximately 1460, was discovered during excavations at the Museum of London in 1999, and a bunch from Bermuda was displayed in the window of a London herbalist in 1663. But bananas were not regularly imported into the UK until 1884 and were not widely available until the early 20th century. The closely woven political, economic, social, and cultural ties between Jamaica and England formed an imperial intimacy that had been rendered historically invisible by the turn of the 20th century. But bananas were the tangible evidence of a connection, or perhaps not. My mother's generation would have taken for granted the presence of sugar in their tea and chocolate and tobacco in their shops, just as they took for granted the tea itself. But bananas, all imported through Bristol, appear throughout the nation during Beatrice's teenage years, and their presence needed to be explained. The banana must have seemed, such an exotic fruit at first sight. If Beatrice knew what bananas were, did she have an image of Jamaica in her mind as she unpeeled one and tasted it? Was a black banana seller a commonplace sight? What would Beatrice have known about Kingston, the city from which imperial direct ships exported bananas to Bristol at a rate of 30,000 bunches a fortnight. Minstrel shows and troops of Jubilee singers from the United States regularly toured the UK, and they performed in Bristol in the latter half of the 19th century. Here in 1886, the Great American Slave Troupe and Brass Band with 16 real Negroes mounted parades throughout the streets the day they arrived, and they performed free serenades outside the old Theatre Royal each day before their show. Black performers were to be found all over the UK in the Victorian and Edwardian periods, at carnivals and on the stage in vaudevilles and theatres. Alfred Jones also arranged here for the Kingston Choral Union of Jamaica to make 3 tours of the UK between 1906 and 1908. They travelled to and from Jamaica on his ships, which docked in Avonmouth. From here, the Kingston Choral Union travelled by train to tour cities and towns all over the country. In 1908, they performed in Wales and the West Country. Even if Beatrice and Maud did not go to the theatre, they would have seen posters and postcards announcing their performances. Confronted by a banana seller, did Beatrice hesitate and furrow her brow in concentration, trying to imagine where such fruit or such people had come from? Would her curiosity have impelled her into a lantern slide show about Jamaica? My mother learnt to dream of Jamaica in her own way, but perhaps Beatrice also instilled in her daughter a particular form of English colonial dreaming. Chamberlain and Jones employed James Johnston, a Jamaican missionary, and Alfred Leader, an amateur photographer from Bristol, to photograph the landscape of Jamaica as a space of desire in the British imagination. The camera was a technology essential to colonial projects of modernization. Lantern slideshows inducted crowds into a particularly modern form of individual and collective subjectivity, forever changing the ways in which the world was known. The metropolitan subject learnt to become a tourist, even without the means to travel. They learnt to observe others as objects susceptible to their mastery. Knowledge of the limitations of their existence, the misery of their daily realities, melted into fascination, absorption, and longing in the evanescent light of modern-day colonies and foreign landscapes. The first hurdle to be overcome in representing Jamaica as a new Riviera was the entrenched belief that the island was a site of disease, tormenting insects, parasites, and a recalcitrant Black population. In order to see for myself what verbal strategies Johnston employed to accomplish this transformation, I had to visit the library at the University of Cambridge. Sitting reading his script, my mind travelled back in time to Bristol in 1903, where I sat with my grandmother in a darkened auditorium. Johnston advised all amateur lecturers to tell their stories in a natural, conversational, free and easy style, which would put them in touch with their listeners, fixing the attention and carrying them along with you. In the dark, we are captivated by Johnston's words, mesmerized by the glow of image after image passing in front of our eyes, and hypnotized by the soothing voice which molds how we see. The audience boards the SS Port Antonio, one of the palatial yachts of the Imperial Direct West India Mail Service, and we are transported from the grey skies, cold and damp climate of Bristol to the port of Kingston, the most important city in the West Indies, set against the backdrop of the magnificent range of the Blue Mountains. We arrive on a beautiful island of luxurious vegetation and lovely scenery, refreshed by invigorating sea breezes, where it is possible to enjoy a degree of health and life such is found nowhere else. We experience a reality so intense, it renders our lives mundane. We travel from the harbour to the Constant Spring Hotel on the tramway of the Canadian-owned West India Electric Company. And once there, we look across the Ligonier Plains to a sea view of unrivaled beauty. The Caribbean, in glorious tints of emerald and blue, and collectively hold our breath. Moonlight brings enchantment. We are lulled to sleep, breathing air laden with the perfume of flowers and listening to the murmuring fronds of the graceful palm tree. The next morning, we travel along Halfway Tree Road, where the fields and foliage assume a deeper green. The glare is less and the air freshens as we ascend the hill toward Castleton Gardens. On the journey, we are enticed by the synchronicity of language and sight. Crowds of women and children walking briskly along with their baskets on their heads, carrying yams, plantains, potatoes, breadfruit, limes, lemons, oranges, pineapples, coconuts, mangoes, shaddock, grapefruits, pawpaws, melons, custard apples, sweet sops, sour sops, rose apples, sapodillas, cherry moya, grandillas, cashews, chocos, tamarinds, avocado, pears, poultry and eggs, etc., destined for a market in Kingston. Words tumble upon words in Johnston's recitation, overwhelming us with a sense of abundance. We take pleasure in the quality of their strangeness, of the alien and the unexplored, the weight and the wealth of their accumulation, the resonance of sound and image, produce an erotic delight. What does it matter if we do not understand what we see and hear? What matters is what we feel, the sensuality of excess. We find ourselves perched above the lush vegetation of Castleton Gardens, Jamaica's famous botanical garden, looking down upon a public footpath. There is a mountain in the distance. The perspective exaggerates the size of the foliage and the vegetation, while dwarfing the human and the social. Our eyes follow a path of light from our high vantage point to a man and a woman standing apart, where the paths converge, surrounded by palms, pines, and banana trees, that diminish them. Behind the man in a white shirt, a tree casts a solid shadow diagonally across the path. We are startled to find another person, almost but not quite, hidden in dappled shade. A shadow delineates the folds of the woman's skirt and runs into the ground. We have the impression that these people are as rooted in place as the enormous trunks of the trees which tower over them. We experience Castleton Gardens both as a study of detail and as a curious absence of detail. We're unable to distinguish any of the features of a human face, but the palm fronds are sharply defined, etched in sharp contrasts of light and dark. We then find ourselves at a lily pond, where to northern eyes, the abundance and productivity of the natural world verges on the alien, chaotic, and out of control, like the sinister landscape of H.G. Wells's scientific romance, The Island of Dr. Moreau. Johnston becomes aware of our discomfort, and our fearfulness ripples through the auditorium as we shift in our seats, lower our eyes, and lose concentration. Beatrice does not know what to make of what she sees and feels. It's all too overwhelming. I leave the auditorium and my grandmother and force myself back to the university library and the script in front of me. Johnston reasserted control at the point where the unknown seemed too strange, too wild for his audience. His lecture belonged to a larger modernist project to teach the British to view Jamaica as a well-ordered, domesticated landscape brimming with picturesque places. So he countered their unease by sitting his audience down by the Cave River for a picnic. The lecture struck a canny balance between thrilling his listeners and offering comfort and reassurance, regularly reminding them that Jamaica was a benign and a healthful paradise, one of the fairest countries in the habitable earth, a land of picturesque views and unrivaled beauty. In his lecture, the phrase, "In what other country could you find?" was repeated many times. Jamaica, the audience were constantly assured, was a dreamland. Jamaicans are revealed to be gardeners, purveyors of abundance, bearers of the island's agricultural riches for the dreamer's consumption, presented in the neat, clean attire that everyone in Edwardian Britain would recognize as the uniform of servants. These Jamaicans are posed with yams, bananas, and unhusked coconuts as they hold, balance, and lift into view gigantic examples of produce. Viewers are reassured that Jamaicans successfully handle nature that otherwise could appear to be out of control, offering up to the viewer the fruits of their labor and their island. Jamaicans become people who, like the landscape against which they are posed, are managed, tamed, and domesticated. The population of the new Jamaica is safe, willing and eager to serve their island's bounty to future tourists. Johnston and his flickering images held his audience spellbound. This picture exhibits not only fair types of the ordinary domestic servant, he intoned, but also good specimens of the Jamaican staff of life, the ubiquitous yam, weaving Jamaicans and Jamaican produce seamlessly together. Johnston's voice rose, his head swept the room, and his eyes sought to make direct contact with each member of his audience, pausing for effect before declaring Jamaica to be the brightest jewel in the British crown. If Beatrice, her sister Maud, and my great-grandmother Rose were among Johnston's audience, they would have learnt that very poor and female though they were, they owned Jamaica, land, people, and produce. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hazel, for that absolutely wonderful talk. Gosh, I guess I would like to applaud on behalf of the audience.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I guess we are ready for any questions from the audience. Please go ahead and type them in the Q&A panel that appears on your screen.
I do have one question I can share from a participant, I believe, who had to leave earlier.
Mm-hmm. Please go ahead, Ty.
Sure. Let's see. So he had noted he taught African history in the Yale history department in the late 1980s, and then some years later, African ethnography and anthropology. He said some of us have been working for the last 50 years or so on the history and ethnography of what was known in West Africa as the Bristol Coast. That is a portion to the west of the Gold Coast at the time, corresponding to what is today the Ivory Coast. He asks then, has your work on Bristol's history extended to the Bristol Coast in West Africa?
No, not other than just the extraction of forced labor, not actually in detail to the coast itself, other than to, in my research, obviously to come across the ways in which the ecology and the environment of the coast was drastically changed, not only because the extraction of so many millions of people, but also because of the way the environment and the ecology had to change to feed people, and not only the forced labor, but also the sailors and the ships that were coming in. So the actual sort of growing of food to support those forts, for example, did change the ecology and the environment drastically. But no, my book actually concentrates on the relation between the two islands of Britain and Jamaica.
So Hazel, I had a question, if I may. I was curious about the construction of the native, of the other, and how that sort of fundamentally seems different for the enslaved, transported peoples versus the colonials who were the imperial state established in India, for example. So the sort of the construction of who is the other, obviously it's informed by very different sort of power dynamics, still of domination, but domination versus enslavement. So I was curious how you would see sort of the reflection of these sorts of power dynamics. How different are they in places like South Asia, Southeast Asia, like India, for example? The British colonial kind of...
Within India? you want me to talk about within India, or I mean, because so the book actually it starts in World War II Britain and goes all the way back to Jamaica, and then ending up in Britain again in the middle of the 18th century, and the relations, the entanglements are concentrated in those areas. But in each of those different historical moments, you can see different formations of the way in which empire, Jamaica being the main focus, actually comes home. So, you know, during World War II, for example, the policing of bodies was very much about black bodies and white bodies within the metropole, you know. And one of the crises that I look at was actually the crises, the brown baby crises. They called it a crisis. It was a sort of moral panic. And that was very much focused on the children who were born of Black American troops who were based in Britain, and people who came from the West Indies, basically. And that was their great fear. It wasn't actually during World War II a fear from the Indian subcontinent so much, because I think there weren't so many troops based there. It's all about so one of the amazing things about empire is the way in which it managed all its populations, right, all over the globe. I mean, I talk a lot about how, you know, Winston Churchill said that Britain stood alone, right, after, you know, against Nazi Germany, which was a completely absurd thing, because they had this huge empire and it was an extraordinary war machine.
Right.
Where is very, very interesting, I think, in terms of their management of different peoples, is actually in the West Indies themselves.
Right.
I mean, post-war Britain is something else, but in the West Indies themselves, after emancipation, which wasn't actually an emancipation, right?
In name only.
Yes. 1834 to 38, a number of people who had been on the plantations, working on the plantations, descendants of Africans, walked away from the plantations. And that led to the British, again, manipulating their population and importing
indentured labor
in the same ships that they'd used for the enslaved, indentured labor from India, and in fact, labor from China. There you see new racial formations developing, and a whole new language and a whole new sort of biopolitics and disciplining of bodies, for certain bodies to be doing certain forms of labor and occupying certain forms of position. And so from that point of view, the West Indies is actually really, you know, horrific, but also interesting in terms of what it actually
it's very revealing.
Reveals about the British Empire.
Right.
In the metropole after World War II, basically what happens in terms of movements of my generation to become Black British is actually an alliance. So, you know, the Black movement in Britain is very different to the Black movement in the US.
Yes.
Because populations from the Indians, particularly the Indian subcontinent, and from the West Indies become allied under that term Black.
Yes.
You know, again, and so the anti-racist movement, the Black-led anti-racist movement, has that sort of, you know, alliance.
Right, and I guess
so each historical moment is different. There isn't a general, you know, answer.
And then you're right, and I think that it's this alliance between the, you know, the South Asian, the immigration from South Asia, that kind of formed this alliance with the flow of people from the West Indies
Mm.
in England, that alliance, right? Yeah, it has that alignment has been very different
Very different.
from the United States, the organization and the power politics in the United States.
And I dwell on those differences because it goes back to that question of identity with which I began. You know, people think sort of identity is something simple that they carry around with them. But I very carefully look at very different historical moments and how that in fact is formed. And especially working with students in the US, you have to explain to them that Black doesn't mean the same thing in different parts of the world. Race doesn't mean the same thing in different parts of the world at different moments. You have to sort of study how it's articulated in particular places and particular times, and how it's resisted too.
Right. And the fact, I think, and am I right in taking away the point that, and this idea of identity is not stable either, because you reflect off others, and depending on where the lines are drawn and how the lines are drawn as who is the other, your identity it's very fluid, it gets reshaped all the time.
Exactly.
But I think the thing that you wonderfully point out is that somehow, with all this shape shifting, the power politics has remained very steady and fixed, right?
Well, the power politics, what actually forms the hegemonic power politics can shift, but the question of subordination, we're still dealing with the aftermath of settler colonialism, so and imperialism, and how those things work their way through are very important to understand. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that work like yours is extremely timely, because at this moment, right, in my field, so if you look at what's happening in space sciences now, we as a human species are still not able to break out of this frame of settler colonialism when we talk about landing on Mars, exploring the universe, etc. Right? I mean, we're not able to break that frame. It's a fundamental relationship with nature and other beings that we really need to disrupt this.
Well, yes, because in my new project, which is sort of rather different, that's sort of also exactly the point. I mean, the point about understanding settler colonialism is that it's yes, it's the domination of indigenous peoples, of the enslavement of peoples, but it's also the domination of the environment.
Yeah. And
the exploitation of various ecologies. So it's actually understanding that settler colonialism is also itself behind this extraordinary environmental and catastrophic climate crisis that we are facing. Absolutely.
Are there any other questions? Ty, do you see any other questions?
Brilliant. No, I think everyone's been enjoying this very informative exchange between the two of you.
Oh, I mean, there's so much to learn from Hazel. I could keep asking more, but I'll give a little bit of space for people to pipe up and ask.
One of the things I did want to say is that when I actually located the archives and found out who the owner was of those enslaved that you saw in that slave register, I also was asking some very similar questions, because he actually turned out to be the son of a carpenter. He went into the British Army and deserts when he's actually in Jamaica. But again, I tried to think about how he had to learn to become a white man in a colony, how he actually had to learn, and adapt to the extraordinary power he was given, the right to brutalize, the right to rape, because of his white skin.
Right.
And so, you know, those historical circumstances were very different to those of a grandmother in Bristol. But thinking about how people's environment and how they engage with that, what the question of whiteness, again, is something that is, you know, that is taught to people, and that they actually adopt, and then they actually have to sort of, you know, practice it.
Right.
And, you know, one of the reasons I actually decided to think about this particular aspect of the book tonight, and about the question of whiteness, is in fact because of what we've been facing where I live, right here, you know, in Guildford, which was a white supremacist attempt to take over the Board of Education. And, you know, we had the elections yesterday, and thank God because people were very well organized, they actually lost, you know, 2-1. But it is a strategy that is, in fact, very, very prominent now. And Guildford was being used as a way to sort of test how this sort of extremism of how these senses of whiteness being under threat, you know, because of sort of multicultural curriculums, can actually be used to mobilize white supremacist politics now. And I think we don't talk about whiteness enough.
I mean,
and its perniciousness.
Yes, and I think, and its resilience. This concept is survived. As you said, it mutates a little bit, but it surfaces, you know, anywhere there's a minor, you know, there's a little bit of room, and it surfaces. And there is resonance. The scary part is that there is resonance even now when we believe there's a lot more awareness. So there's a very nice question from Megan Fountain, who's asking, did you take any inspiration from novels as well as from the historical archives?
Oh, yes. You know, the book is full, in fact, of sort of various explicit and less explicit nods to novels. Absolutely, particularly, you know, I mean, writers like Michael Ondaatje and Kaz Phillips, and even Jane Austen, I talk about a lot, and Virginia Woolf. But, you know, in terms of trying to deal with people who didn't leave records, whose records weren't in the archives is full of, you know, the records of the wealthy, those who write diaries or write the plantation records or whatever. But when you're dealing with massive silences, it's that case of sort of translating some very complex historical research into ways in which a reader can imagine the lives of people. And that, you know, that is where novelists are actually extraordinary, especially novelists who really think seriously about, you know, about history, like Ondaatje and Kaz Phillips. Yes.
And there's another question from Mary Marshall Clark. What about Andrea Levy, The Long Song?
All of Andrea Levy's, you know, work, I mean, I have read and I'm deeply indebted to. Absolutely, yeah. And particularly, you know, in the Second World War, I think the way in which she talks about the relationships between, you know, white women and Black military personnel is extraordinarily revealing. Yeah, absolutely.
Are there any other questions?
I don't see any further ones.
So before we close, I'm really tempted to ask one more question, Hazel, if I may. How do you see this? You know, I don't want to use the word reconciliation because I have to say there are days when I'm optimistic and there are days when I'm not. So do you see that? How do you see the way forward? How are we going to settle these issues of identity, power, power relations, we all aspire for equity and equality of opportunity and all of this. So how are we really going to transcend all of this? Can we?
Oh, Priya, if only I had the answer to that. I mean, heavens above. I mean, it's what some of us are struggling for every single day. In our work, in our research, in our politics, there is no simple reconciliation. I mean, there has to be, a massive transformation, I think, of imagination. And a number of people, a number of historians, filmmakers, artists, because I think visual art is also very, very important, are trying to accomplish that. Particularly a number of sort of indigenous, writers like Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz and Nick Estes or whatever, and Raoul Peck's new series, Exterminate the Brutes. We have to completely, radically understand the way in which, particularly, this country, the Americas, are so profoundly still shaped by stolen lands, the decimation of indigenous peoples, the absolute, ignorance, because we really need to recover a lot of those lost knowledges that settler colonialism decided, that were worthless, whether it's about the environment, the ecology, others' way to live, but the indebtedness, the deep, deep indebtedness to the horrors that settler colonialism understood. I mean, I think we've only just begun.
And it is a grand collusion, right? Because in a society that, capitalist society, voraciously capitalist society, these are the underpinnings. So obviously,
yes, and these and the voraciousness, continues. Indigenous peoples, Black people, they still live in the most polluted areas, right? They are still considered waste, if you like, in terms of sort of corporate power. They are, disposable. They can have drinking water that isn't fit to drink. So these inequalities established under settler colonialism continue. You can see that in the pandemic figures, who actually suffered the most.
Right. And so
there is no easy reconciliation there, but I think, white supremacy has to be brought to account.
Yeah. I mean, it's for me, the tenacity of white supremacy is what is shocking. I mean, I shouldn't be shocked, but but I think we have no choice but to confront, understand, and completely reorient our view. And I really hope that the climate crisis and the growing political awareness of all these inequities, historical, that resonate to the present day, I really hope they combine and they provide new tinder, right? That this combination of the way in which we've ravaged nature as well, right? I don't know. And that is sort of...
Well, the Indigenous presence at the climate conference in Glasgow is incredibly strong. And extremely articulate. I mean, saying the most, if only people would listen, if only people would listen to them.
Yeah. Anyway, I could go on and would be extremely selfish of me, but are there any other questions? Ty, do you have any questions?
No, thank you. It's just, what a talk. What a talk.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Frankly, I'm speechless. It was just phenomenal. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you everybody for, all the support and stuff. So thank you very much. It was great.
Thank you so much, Hazel.
You're welcome, Priya. Thank you for the invitation.
Most welcome.